Picture a glittering 1920s masquerade at Ravenwood Manor, where masked guests dance under chandeliers, until a mock duel turns deadly, a scholar stabbed with a stolen dagger. Enter Miss Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster unraveling a web of secrets, a desperate hostess hiding debts, a scarred soldier with a shameful past, a flamboyant organizer facing ruin, and a heartbroken guest seeking vengeance. In a whirlwind of clues, ledgers, a pearl earring, a scratched prop table, she exposes a calculated murder disguised as theater. Can she unmask the killer before the truth slips away? Chapter 1. The Invitation to Ravenwood. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where the days unfolded with the gentle predictability of a well-worn novel, Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlor window, her knitting needles clicking softly in rhythm with her thoughts. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over her roses, but her attention was fixed on an unexpected arrival. A cream-colored envelope, its embossed crest hinting at grandeur. She adjusted her spectacles, her delicate fingers tracing the elegant script addressed to Miss J. Marple. The sender was Lady Beatrice Harrow, a name faintly familiar from long-ago London seasons, inviting her to a masquerade ball at Ravenwood Manor. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. Lady Beatrice, she recalled, was a woman of charm and ambition, widowed young and left to maintain a crumbling estate. The invitation promised a night of mystery and merriment, with a theatrical mock duel as the evening's centerpiece. Such spectacles, Miss Marple mused, often concealed more than they revealed, much like the village fetes where gossip hid behind pleasantries. She sipped her tea, considering. Her nephew Raymond often teased her for seeing intrigue in every gathering, yet her instincts, honed by years of observing human nature, rarely erred. The journey to Ravenwood, a sprawling manor in the neighboring county, would be a diversion from St. Mary Mead's routine. She pictured the masked guests, their identities cloaked in silk and velvet, their motives perhaps less guarded than they believed. Her mind drifted to a long-ago ball in her youth, where a stolen glance had sparked a scandal. Such events, she knew, were breeding grounds for secrets. Lady Beatrice's invitation mentioned a select guest list, society figures, a few eccentrics, and a renowned organizer. Mr. Clarence Vane, whose theatrical flair was whispered about even in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and opened her writing desk, penning a polite acceptance. She would need a mask, something simple yet unobtrusive. A lace affair, perhaps, to blend into the crowd. Her wardrobe, practical and unassuming, held a dove-gray gown suitable for the occasion, its modesty a contrast to the ostentation she expected at Ravenwood. As she packed her small suitcase, she tucked in a notebook, its pages blank but ready for observations. People, she knew, revealed themselves in fleeting gestures, a tightened jaw, a hesitant pause, details others overlooked. The train to Ravenwood wound through autumnal hills, the landscape a tapestry of amber and crimson. Miss Marple, seated by the window, watched the world blur past, her mind already sifting possibilities. Why had Lady Beatrice invited her, a quiet spinster with no claim to high society? Perhaps it was mere courtesy, or perhaps, as with the vicar's wife who once invited her to tea to probe a rumor, there was an ulterior motive. Either way, Miss Marple felt a prickle of anticipation. Ravenwood Manor, with its masks and mock duels, promised more than a night of revelry. It promised a puzzle. Chapter 2. The Masks of Ravenwood. The carriage wheels crunched over the gravel drive as Miss Jane Marple arrived at Ravenwood Manor, its silhouette looming against the twilight sky like a stage set for a Gothic drama. The manor's ivy-clad towers and arched windows glowed with the flicker of countless candles, their light spilling onto the lawns where masked figures glided toward the entrance. Miss Marple adjusted her lace mask, its delicate filigree allowing her to observe without drawing attention. Her gray gown, understated yet elegant, blended seamlessly with the crowd, a choice she had made deliberately. In her experience, the unobtrusive were often the best positioned to notice what others missed. The grand hall of Ravenwood was a spectacle of opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast prisms across the polished marble floor, and gilded mirrors reflected a kaleidoscope of costumes, peacock feathers, velvet capes, and glittering domino masks. A string quartet played a lilting waltz, its notes weaving through the hum of conversation. Miss Marple paused at the threshold, her keen eyes scanning the room. She had attended enough village gatherings to know that beneath the polish of such events lay undercurrents of rivalry, envy, and unspoken grudges. A masquerade, with its promise of anonymity, only sharpened those edges. Lady Beatrice Harrow, the hostess, stood near a towering arrangement of roses, her crimson gown a bold contrast to the muted tones around her. Her mask, adorned with rubies, framed eyes that sparkled with practiced charm as she greeted guests. Miss Marple approached, noting the slight tension in Lady Beatrice's posture, a tightness about the shoulders that reminded her of Mrs. Elwood, the St. Mary Mead seamstress, who smiled through financial strain. "Miss Marple, how delightful you could come," Lady Beatrice said, her voice warm but carrying a note of distraction. "I trust the journey was pleasant?" "Quite pleasant, thank you," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "Your invitation was most intriguing. A mock duel, I understand? Quite the theatrical touch." She watched Lady Beatrice closely, noting the brief flicker of unease in her eyes. "Oh, yes," Lady Beatrice said, recovering swiftly. "Mr. Vane, our organizer, insisted on it. He's a genius with spectacle. You must meet him." She gestured toward a man in a flamboyant emerald coat, his mask a grinning harlequin that seemed to mock the room's elegance. Mr. Clarence Vane was directing a servant with exaggerated gestures, his voice carrying over the music. Miss Marple made a mental note. His energy was that of a performer, but performers, she knew, often hid their true selves behind their roles. As Lady Beatrice was drawn away by another guest, Miss Marple drifted toward the edge of the ballroom, her small figure nearly invisible among the swirling dancers. She found a velvet-upholstered chair near a potted palm, a vantage point that offered a clear view of the room. Her fingers rested lightly on her reticule, but her mind was busy cataloging the guests. There was a young woman in a sapphire gown, her laughter too bright, her glances darting toward a man in a black domino mask. A portly gentleman in a powdered wig was whispering to a companion, their heads bent close. Each interaction, Miss Marple knew, was a thread in a tapestry she would soon unravel. Her attention was drawn to the two men central to the evening's entertainment, Captain Lionel Drake and Mr. Theodore Grayson, the duelists. Captain Drake, resplendent in a naval officer's costume, complete with gold epaulets, moved through the crowd with the confidence of a man accustomed to command. His mask, a simple black band, did little to conceal his chiseled features or the scar that ran along his jaw, a relic, perhaps, of his military days. Miss Marple recalled a village sergeant who carried himself similarly, his bravado masking a quick temper. Drake's smile was charming, but his eyes, she noted, lingered too long on certain guests, as if assessing threats. Mr. Grayson, by contrast, was a study in restraint. His costume, a scholar's robe of deep burgundy, suited his lean frame and thoughtful demeanor. His mask, adorned with subtle silver filigree, covered half his face, but Miss Marple caught the furrow of his brow as he conversed with a woman in a peacock-feathered headdress. Grayson's movements were precise, almost hesitant, as if he were out of place among the revelry. Miss Marple's thoughts flickered to Mr. Pemberton, the saint, Mary Mead librarian, whose quiet demeanor hid a mind sharp enough to cut through deception. Grayson, she suspected, was no mere academic playing a part. A sudden movement caught her eye. A woman in a silver gown, her mask adorned with pearls, stood alone near the French doors leading to the terrace. Her posture was rigid, her gloved hands twisting a silk fan with a nervous intensity. Miss Marple recognized her as Mrs. Evelyn Carr, a name mentioned in passing by Lady Beatrice during their correspondence. Mrs. Carr's presence intrigued her. She was not a regular in society circles, yet her invitation suggested a purpose. As Mrs. Carr glanced toward Grayson, her lips tightened, and Miss Marple made another mental note. There was history there, perhaps not a pleasant one. The music shifted to a livelier tune, and the dancers parted to allow Mr. Vane to take center stage. He clapped his hands, his harlequin mask gleaming under the chandeliers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice resonant with theatrical flair, "tonight we offer you a spectacle to rival the courts of old. A mock duel between two gallant gentlemen, Captain Lionel Drake and Mr. Theodore Grayson, fought with the elegance of a bygone era." The crowd applauded, their masks lending an air of conspiratorial excitement. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Vane's enthusiasm was infectious, but she wondered what lay behind it. A man so invested in spectacle might have more at stake than mere entertainment. As the guests buzzed with anticipation, Miss Marple observed the interactions around her. Lady Beatrice, now circulating among the crowd, paused to speak with Captain Drake, her hand resting briefly on his arm. The gesture was fleeting, but Miss Marple noted the captain's slight stiffening, as if the touch were unwelcome. Nearby, Mr. Grayson stood apart, his gaze fixed on the floor, though his head tilted slightly toward Mrs. Carr, who had moved closer to the ballroom's edge. The dynamics were subtle but telling, like the village tea parties where a glance or a pause spoke volumes. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a young footman offering her a glass of champagne. She declined with a gentle smile, preferring to keep her wits sharp. The footman, barely out of his teens, had the eager demeanor of someone new to service. "Quite a grand evening, isn't it, miss?" he ventured, his eyes bright behind his simple mask. "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her tone encouraging. "You must see a great deal from your vantage point. Tell me, do you know the gentleman in the duel?" She asked it lightly, as if making idle conversation, but her eyes were alert for any flicker of insight. The footman hesitated, then leaned closer. "Captain Drake's a bold one, miss, always joking with the staff, but he's got a sharp edge. Mr. Grayson, though, he's quieter. Keeps to himself like he's thinking hard about something. Saw him arguing with that lady in silver earlier, out by the rose garden." He glanced nervously at Mrs. Carr, then straightened as another servant called him away. Miss Marple filed the information away. An argument in the rose garden suggested more than a passing acquaintance between Grayson and Mrs. Carretera. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead's scandal, where a whispered quarrel in the churchyard had unraveled a web of deceit. The footman's words, though brief, were a piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple was adept at collecting such fragments. The ballroom grew quieter as the hour of the duel approached. Servants cleared a space at the center, where a velvet rope marked the boundaries of the makeshift stage. Mr. Vane bustled about inspecting the props, two blunted swords laid on a table draped in black cloth. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting his quick, almost furtive glances at the crowd. Was he ensuring the props were correct, or was he searching for someone? His hands, she observed, trembled slightly as he adjusted the swords, a detail that might mean nothing, or everything. Captain Drake and Mr. Grayson took their places, each receiving a sword from Vane. The crowd formed a semicircle, their masks lending an eerie uniformity to their faces. Miss Marple remained seated, her position offering a clear view of the duelists and the key players nearby. Lady Beatrice stood to one side, her crimson gown a beacon in the dim light. Mrs. Carr lingered near the terrace doors, her fan now still, her eyes fixed on Grayson. Mr. Vane hovered at the edge of the stage, his harlequin mask a grotesque contrast to his nervous energy. The quartet struck a dramatic chord, signaling the duel's start. Captain Drake raised his sword with a flourish, his movements fluid and confident. Grayson, by contrast, held his weapon with a scholar's precision, his stance defensive. The blades clashed, the sound sharp and theatrical, eliciting murmurs of approval from the crowd. Miss Marple, however, was not watching the swords. Her eyes darted between the duelists' faces, the subtle shifts in their expressions, and the reactions of those around them. Drake's scar seemed to catch the light as he lunged, while Grayson's mask slipped slightly, revealing a bead of sweat on his brow. As the duel progressed, Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, drawing parallels to her village observations. She thought of Mr. Henley, the St. Mary Mead butcher, whose jovial demeanor hid a grudge against a rival. Drake's bravado was similar, but Grayson's restraint suggested a deeper complexity, perhaps a man burdened by knowledge or guilt. Mrs. Carr's fixed gaze, meanwhile, spoke of a personal stake, not unlike the vicar's sister who once watched her former suitor with quiet intensity. And Lady Beatrice, her poised exterior could not fully mask the strain of a hostess under pressure, perhaps financial, perhaps personal. The duel reached a crescendo, the blades flashing in a choreographed dance. The crowd leaned forward, caught in the spell of the performance. Miss Marple, however, remained detached, her mind sifting through the evening's details. The footman's gossip, Vane's trembling hands, Mrs. Carr's nervous fan, and the subtle tension between Lady Beatrice and Drake. Each was a clue, a whisper of motive or opportunity, waiting to be woven into a coherent pattern. As the music swelled, signaling the duel's climax, Miss Marple felt a prickle of unease. The masks, the costumes, the orchestrated drama. It was all too perfect, too designed to distract. She had seen such distractions before, in village halls and drawing rooms, where spectacle concealed truth. Her fingers tightened on her reticule, her instincts telling her that Ravenwood's masquerade was more than a celebration. It was a stage, and someone, she was certain, had scripted a far darker act. Chapter 3. The duel begins. The ballroom of Ravenwood Manor, with its glittering chandeliers and sea of masked faces, held its breath as the mock duel commenced. Miss Jane Marple sat primly near the velvet rope, her lace mask framing eyes that missed nothing. The string quartet's notes faded into a single, suspenseful chord, and the crowd's murmurs hushed, all eyes fixed on the two duelists at the center of the cleared stage. Captain Lionel Drake, his naval costume resplendent with gold braid, struck a theatrical pose, his blunted sword catching the candlelight. Mr. Theodore Grayson, in his somber burgundy robe, stood opposite, his stance rigid, his grip on the sword betraying a faint tremor. Miss Marple noted the contrast. Drake's swagger, like a peacock strutting before an audience, and Grayson's restraint, reminiscent of a St. Mary Mead schoolmaster preparing for an unwelcome task. Mr. Clarence Vane, the organizer, stepped forward, his harlequin mask gleaming with an almost sinister mirth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he proclaimed, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a showman, "prepare to witness a clash of honor, a dance of steel, from an age of chivalry." The crowd applauded, their masks lending an air of collective conspiracy. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. She had seen such theatrics before, at village pageants where pomp hid petty rivalries. Vane's flourish as he retreated to the sidelines seemed excessive, as if he were compensating for some inner disquiet. The duel began with a clash of blades, the sound sharp but hollow, confirming the swords were indeed blunted for safety. Captain Drake lunged with confidence, his movements fluid, almost playful, as if he relished the spotlight. Grayson parried, his actions precise but mechanical, lacking the captain's flair. Miss Marple's gaze darted between them, noting Drake's scar twitching with each grin, and Grayson's eyes, partially obscured by his silver filigreed mask, narrowing with focus. She recalled a fencing match at a St. Mary Mead charity event, where a young man's overconfidence had led to a careless stumble. Here, she sensed a different kind of danger, one not choreographed. The crowd gasped and cheered as the duelists circled, their swords flashing in a carefully rehearsed rhythm. Lady Beatrice Harrow, standing near the front, clapped with measured enthusiasm, her crimson gown a vivid contrast to her pale, taut expression. Miss Marple noted her hostess's hands, clasped tightly, the knuckles whitening beneath her gloves. Was it merely the strain of hosting, or something more? Nearby, Mrs. Evelyn Carr lingered by the terrace doors, her silver gown catching the light as she leaned forward, her fan now motionless, her gaze locked on Grayson. The intensity of her stare reminded Miss Marple of a village widow who once watched a rival with silent venom. The duel reached its midpoint, the choreography growing more intricate. Drake executed a flamboyant feint, drawing laughter from the crowd, while Grayson countered with a measured thrust, his face unreadable. Miss Marple's attention shifted briefly to Mr. Vane, who hovered near the prop table, his fingers twitching as if tempted to intervene. She made a mental note. Vane's role as organizer gave him access to the swords before the duel, a detail that might prove significant. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden shift in the duel's rhythm. Grayson faltered, his sword dipping as he stepped back, his free hand brushing his side. The crowd assumed it was part of the act, but Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. His movement was not theatrical, it was instinctive, as if responding to pain. Before she could process this, Grayson staggered, his sword clattering to the floor. A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd, some clapping, others whispering. Drake lowered his weapon, his grin faltering, and took a step forward as if to assist. Then Grayson crumpled, his burgundy robe pooling around him like spilled wine. A woman screamed, and the quartet's music faltered. Miss Marple leaned forward, her heart quickening. She saw it now, a dark stain spreading across Grayson's side, unmistakable even in the candlelight. This was no performance. Blood glistened on the marble floor, and the air grew thick with shock. "Fetch a doctor." Lady Beatrice's voice cut through the chaos, her composure cracking as she pushed through the crowd. Mr. Vane rushed to Grayson's side, his harlequin mask absurdly incongruous as he knelt beside the fallen man. Captain Drake stood frozen, his sword still in hand, his face a mask of bewilderment. Or was it calculation? Mrs. Carr, Miss Marple noted, had not moved from her spot, her eyes wide but her posture rigid, as if rooted by some private horror. Miss Marple rose, her small figure threading through the panicked guests with surprising agility. She reached the edge of the stage as a doctor, summoned from among the guests, knelt beside Grayson. The man's face was grim. As he loosened Grayson's robe, revealing a deep wound, unmistakably from a sharp blade. "He's gone," the doctor murmured, his voice low, but carrying in the sudden silence. A collective gasp rose, and whispers of murder began to circulate. Inspector Harrow, a burly man with a mustache that seemed to bristle with authority, arrived swiftly, his presence announced by the clink of his watch chain. Miss Marple noted his familiarity with Lady Beatrice, a cousin, perhaps, given their shared surname, and the way she clutched his arm as he surveyed the scene. "Nobody leaves," he barked, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "This is a crime scene now." His eyes swept the room, lingering briefly on Miss Marple, who met his gaze with a serene nod. She had dealt with inspectors before, men who underestimated her until her observations proved sharper than their own. Her attention turned to the prop table, where the blunted swords lay discarded. Among them, glinting in the candlelight, was a dagger, ornate, with a carved hilt and unmistakably sharp. It was not part of the duel's props. Miss Marple was certain. Vane had been explicit about the safety of the swords. She recalled a village play where a prop knife had been switched for a real one, nearly causing tragedy. Here, the switch had been fatal. She stepped closer, careful not to touch anything, her eyes tracing the dagger's intricate design. It was no common weapon, likely an antique, perhaps from Ravenwood's own collection. As the inspector began herding guests away from the stage, Miss Marple lingered, her mind racing. The dagger's presence suggested premeditation, but by whom? Captain Drake, with his military precision, could have executed the switch during the duel's chaos. Mr. Vane, with his access to the props, had opportunity. Lady Beatrice, as hostess, knew every corner of the manor, including where such a dagger might be found. And Mrs. Carr, her intense gaze and earlier argument with Grayson, hinted at a motive rooted in the past. Miss Marple's thoughts flickered to a St. Mary Mead garden party, where a seemingly trivial quarrel had led to a theft. Here, the stakes were far higher. The crowd was ushered to the drawing room, their masks now seeming less festive, more sinister, as if each concealed a guilty secret. Miss Marple followed, her steps measured, her mind already weaving the threads of what she had seen. The duel, meant to entertain, had become a stage for murder, and the players, Drake, Vane, Lady Beatrice, and Mrs. Carr were now suspects. She settled into a corner of the drawing room, her notebook tucked discreetly in her reticule, ready to capture the fleeting details that would unravel the truth. The masks of Ravenwood, she knew, hid more than faces. They hid a killer, and she was determined to unmask them. Chapter 4. A Murder Unmasked. The drawing room of Ravenwood Manor, where the guests had been herded after the fatal duel, hummed with nervous whispers, the air thick with the scent of beeswax candles and fear. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in a high-backed chair near a bay window, her lace mask now resting in her lap, her serene expression belying the sharp calculations of her mind. The opulent room, with its damask wallpaper and heavy velvet curtains, felt oppressive under the weight of what had transpired. The guests, their masks partially removed or askew, cast furtive glances at one another, their earlier revelry replaced by suspicion. Miss Marple observed them all, her thoughts as precise as the stitches in the shawl she had left behind in St. Mary Mead. Inspector Harrow stood at the center of the room, his broad shoulders squared as he addressed the assembled. "Until we've questioned everyone, no one leaves Ravenwood," he declared, his mustache twitching with authority. His eyes, sharp but not unkind, lingered on Lady Beatrice Harrow, who stood near the fireplace, her crimson gown now seeming garish in the somber atmosphere. Miss Marple noted the inspector's deference to his cousin, a nod here, a softened tone there, suggesting a familial loyalty that might cloud his judgment. She had seen such dynamics before in the village constable, who overlooked a friend's petty theft. Her gaze shifted to the other suspects, now separated from the crowd for preliminary questioning. Captain Lionel Drake leaned against a bookcase, his naval costume slightly disheveled, his scar more prominent in the flickering light. His posture was casual, but Miss Marple caught the way his fingers drummed against the wood, a restless tick she associated with men under strain, like the St. Mary Mead postmaster caught falsifying accounts. Mr. Clarence Vane, his harlequin mask discarded, paced near the door, his emerald coat rumpled, his eyes darting as if seeking an escape. Mrs. Evelyn Carr sat alone on a settee, her silver gown pooling around her like moonlight, her hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles showed white through her gloves. Her face, now unmasked, was pale, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, suggesting a grief too complex for tears. Miss Marple's attention returned to the ballroom, visible through the open doors, where the inspector's men were securing the scene. The blood on the marble floor had darkened, a stark reminder of Theodore Grayson's fate. The ornate dagger, its carved hilt gleaming, had been carefully removed by a constable and placed in a cloth, but not before Miss Marple had memorized its details. A serpent motif, inlaid with what appeared to be jade, suggesting a piece from a private collection rather than a theatrical prop. She recalled a village auction where a similar antique had sparked a bitter dispute. Such objects, she knew, often carried stories of their own. Inspector Harrow began his interrogations, starting with Lady Beatrice. Miss Marple, though not invited to join, positioned herself to overhear, her small figure blending into the room's shadows. "I was watching the duel, like everyone else," Lady Beatrice said, her voice steady, but her hands smoothing her gown repeatedly, a gesture Miss Marple recognized as a sign of concealed agitation. "I had no hand in the props. Mr. Vane managed all that. Theodore was a dear friend, my financial advisor. His loss is..." devastating. Her words were polished, but Miss Marple detected a rehearsed quality, like the vicar's wife reciting platitudes to deflect gossip. The inspector pressed gently. "You met with Mr. Grayson earlier today, did you not? In the library?" Lady Beatrice's eyes widened briefly, then narrowed. "A brief discussion about estate matters," she replied. "Nothing more." Miss Marple made a mental note. The library meeting, unmentioned until now, suggested a private matter, perhaps one Grayson had not welcomed. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead, widow, who hid debts behind a facade of generosity. Lady Beatrice's strained elegance hinted at similar troubles. Captain Drake was next, his voice carrying a forced joviality. "It was a performance, Inspector, nothing more. I barely knew Grayson, old university acquaintance, that's all. The sword I used was blunted, checked by Vane himself." His grin was disarming, but Miss Marple noticed his eyes flicker toward the ballroom, where the dagger had been found. His gloves, she recalled, were pristine despite the duel's intensity, unlike the village blacksmith whose hands bore the marks of his trade. A man so careful, she mused, might be hiding more than his hands. Mr. Vane's interrogation was marked by theatrical indignation. "The dagger wasn't mine," he protested, his hands flailing. "I inspected every prop. Those swords were safe. Someone must have tampered with them." His voice cracked, and Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his brow, despite the room's chill. His desperation reminded her of a saint, Mary Mead, shopkeeper who overpromised to creditors, his bluster masking financial ruin. Vane's role gave him opportunity, but his panic suggested either guilt or fear of being framed. Mrs. Carr, when questioned, spoke softly, her words measured. "I was a guest, nothing more. I knew Theodore years ago, but we hadn't spoken in ages." Her eyes avoided the inspector's, focusing instead on her fan, now crumpled in her lap. Miss Marple recognized the posture of someone guarding a painful secret, like the village spinster who never spoke of a lost love, but wore her sorrow in every gesture. Mrs. Carr's connection to Grayson, whatever it was, ran deep. As the interrogations concluded, Miss Marple slipped into the ballroom, where a constable guarded the scene. She approached the prop table, her steps soft, her demeanor unthreatening. "Such a terrible thing," she murmured to the young officer, her voice gentle. "You must see so much in your work. Did you notice anything odd about the table before the duel?" The constable, disarmed by her grandmotherly air, hesitated, then said, "I wasn't here then, ma'am, but the stagehand mentioned Captain Drake checking the swords just before the performance. Said he was particular about their balance." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Drake's inspection of the props was a detail she had suspected, but confirmation sharpened its significance. She pictured the captain, with his military precision, slipping the dagger into place during a moment of distraction. Yet Vane's access, Lady Beatrice's secrecy, and Mrs. Carr's evident pain each added layers to the puzzle. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead mystery, where a stolen brooch was traced to a seemingly innocent act of tidying. Here, the dagger's switch was no accident. The inspector announced that the guests could retire to their rooms but must remain on the estate. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes scanning the drawing room. A discarded mask lay on the settee where Mrs. Carr had sat, its pearl adornments dulled by traces of face powder. Miss Marple bent closer, noting the faint scent of lavender, a detail that might mean nothing, or everything. She straightened, her mind weaving the night's observations. Lady Beatrice's hidden strain, Drake's clean gloves, Vane's panic, Mrs. Carr's crumpled fan, and the dagger's serpentine hilt. Each was a thread, and Miss Marple, with her knack for untangling human nature, knew the truth lay in their knot. As she made her way to her guest room, the manor's corridors dim and echoing, she felt the weight of Ravenwood's secrets. The masquerade had ended, but the masks of deceit remained, and she was determined to peel them away, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 5. The Host's Secrets. The morning after the fatal duel dawned gray over Ravenwood Manor, the mist clinging to its ivy-clad walls like a shroud. Miss Jane Marple, having slept little, sat by her guest room's window, her knitting needles idle in her lap as she gazed at the damp gardens below. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind, with the clarity of a village tableau, each detail sharp and significant. The ornate dagger, the blood on the marble, the suspects' guarded faces, all pointed to a truth hidden beneath Ravenwood's polished surface. Her task now was to probe deeper, starting with the hostess, Lady Beatrice Harrow, whose poised exterior had cracked under the strain of murder. Miss Marple descended to the breakfast room, where the guests were gathered under Inspector Harrow's watchful eye. The atmosphere was subdued, the clink of porcelain and the murmur of strained pleasantries replacing the previous night's revelry. Lady Beatrice, dressed in a somber navy gown, presided over the table with a forced smile, her hands fluttering as she poured tea. Miss Marple, accepting a cup with a nod, noted the faint tremor in her hostess's fingers, reminiscent of Mrs. Clarkson, the St. Mary Mead baker, who hid debts behind a cheerful facade. Lady Beatrice's eyes darted toward the inspector, stationed near the door, his presence a reminder of the manor's new reality. Taking a seat near the window, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mild demeanor inviting conversation. She turned to a young maid serving scones, her voice soft but deliberate. "You must be terribly shaken, my dear, after last night's tragedy. Did you know Mr. Grayson at all?" The maid, flustered but eager to please, glanced at Lady Beatrice before replying. "Not well, ma'am, but he was often in the library with her ladyship, going over papers. Seemed a serious sort, always polite." Miss Marple smiled encouragingly, filing away the detail. The library, mentioned again, was becoming a focal point. After breakfast, as the guests dispersed under the inspector's orders to remain on the estate, Miss Marple sought out Lady Beatrice. She found her in the conservatory, a glass-walled haven filled with ferns and orchids, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. Lady Beatrice was pruning a rose bush with excessive care, her movements betraying agitation. "Miss Marple," she said, forcing brightness, "I hope you're managing under these dreadful circumstances." "Quite well, thank you," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle. "Though I confess such events stir my curiosity. Mr. Grayson was your financial advisor, I understand. It must have been a comfort to have such a capable man." Her words were innocent, but her eyes were sharp, watching for any telltale sign. Lady Beatrice's pruning shears paused, then resumed. "Theodore was invaluable," she said carefully. "Ravenwood's upkeep is challenging, and he had a knack for numbers." Her voice held a note of strain, and Miss Marple noted the way her gaze flickered toward the manor, as if its walls held secrets she feared might spill. "I imagine so," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic. "In St. Mary Mead, We had a gentleman who managed accounts for the church, only to find discrepancies that caused quite a stir. It's remarkable how financial matters can reveal hidden tensions." She paused, letting the words hang, and saw Lady Beatrice's lips tighten. "There were no tensions," Lady Beatrice said quickly, snipping a rose stem with unnecessary force. "Theodore and I discussed investments, nothing more. Our meeting in the library was routine." Her defensiveness, Miss Marple thought, was like that of a village widow caught exaggerating her charity donations, truth mixed with evasion. Miss Marple changed tack, her voice softer still. "The dagger used in the duel. It was quite distinctive. An antique, perhaps, from Ravenwood's collection?" Lady Beatrice's shears slipped, nicking her finger, and a bead of blood welled up. She dabbed it with a handkerchief, her composure faltering. "I wouldn't know," she said, her voice tight. "Mr. Vane handled all the props. If it came from the manor, it was without my knowledge." Her eyes met Miss Marple's briefly, then slid away, and Miss Marple made a mental note. The dagger's origin was a sore point, and Lady Beatrice's denial was too swift to be entirely convincing. Leaving the conservatory, Miss Marple wandered toward the library, a vast room lined with leather-bound volumes and dominated by a mahogany desk. The inspector's men had searched it, but Miss Marple's interest lay in what they might have overlooked. She examined the desk, noting a faint ink stain and a scattering of papers. Ledgers, she realized, with figures in Grayson's neat hand. One page, partially tucked beneath a blotter, caught her eye. A note about a loan, with Lady Beatrice's name and a sum that made Miss Marple's eyebrows rise. She recalled a saint. Mary Mead's scandal, where a forged ledger had unraveled a marriage. Here, the figures suggested Ravenwood's financial strain was more dire than Lady Beatrice admitted. A soft cough interrupted her thoughts. The butler, an elderly man with a stooped posture, stood in the doorway. "May I assist you, ma'am?" he asked, his tone polite but wary. Miss Marple smiled, disarming him with her grandmotherly air. "Just admiring the library," she said. "Mr. Grayson spent much time here, I gather. Did he seem troubled during his visits?" The butler hesitated, then said, "He was reserved, ma'am, but lately he seemed preoccupied. Once I overheard him tell her ladyship that certain investments were risky. She wasn't pleased." His voice lowered, as if fearing eavesdroppers, and Miss Marple nodded, encouraging him to continue. "The day of the ball," he added. "He brought a folder of papers, said they needed urgent discussion. That's all I know." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. The folder, the risky investments, Lady Beatrice's evasiveness, the pieces were forming a pattern. She recalled a village banker who hid losses until a creditor's audit exposed him. Lady Beatrice's reliance on Grayson suggested a similar vulnerability. Had Grayson uncovered something she wished to keep hidden? The dagger, perhaps taken from a display case in this very manner, pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of Ravenwood's treasures. As she left the library, Miss Marple passed Captain Drake in the corridor, his naval costume replaced by a tweed jacket, his scar stark in the daylight. He nodded curtly, his eyes avoiding hers, and she noted his hurried stride, as if eager to escape scrutiny. Mr. Vane was next, crossing the hall with a distracted air, muttering about the ruin of his reputation. Mrs. Carr, glimpsed through a window, stood alone in the garden, her silver gown exchanged for mourning black, her posture one of quiet despair. Each suspect, Miss Marple mused, carried a burden, but Lady Beatrice's secrets, financial, personal, or both, were the thread she would tug next. Returning to her room, Miss Marple opened her notebook, jotting down the morning's findings. The ledger, the butler's words, Lady Beatrice's nicked finger. The hostess's charm, she knew, was a mask as carefully crafted as those worn at the ball, and behind it lay motives that might have turned a mock duel into a murder. As the mist outside thickened, Miss Marple felt the clarity of her purpose sharpen. Ravenwood's secrets were unraveling, and she would follow the trail, one careful observation at a time. Chapter 6. The Opponent's Past. The afternoon light filtered weakly through Ravenwood Manor's tall windows, casting long shadows across the oak-paneled corridors. Miss Jane Marple, her gray shawl draped over her shoulders, moved with quiet purpose toward the billiard room, where she had learned Captain Lionel Drake was lingering. The morning's revelations about Lady Beatrice's financial straits had sharpened her focus, but now her thoughts turned to the dashing duelist, whose confident exterior belied a tension she had glimpsed in his restless fingers and guarded glances. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had known men like Drake, charming, bold, but with pasts that clung like damp to a cellar wall. She intended to probe that past, sensing it held a key to Theodore Grayson's murder. The billiard room was a masculine retreat, its walls adorned with hunting trophies and a faded regimental banner. Captain Drake leaned over the table, cue in hand, his tweed jacket a stark contrast to the flamboyant naval costume of the previous night. His scar, a jagged line along his jaw, seemed more pronounced in the daylight, a silent testament to battles fought, or perhaps misdeeds survived. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his grin quick but not quite reaching his eyes. "Miss Marple, an unexpected pleasure," he said, his tone carrying the easy charm of a man accustomed to disarming others. "Care for a game?" "Oh, no, thank you," she replied, her voice mild as she settled into a leather armchair. "My hands are better suited to knitting than billiards, I'm afraid, but I do enjoy watching and hearing stories. You've led a fascinating life. Captain, I'm sure, military service, university days. You and Mr. Grayson were acquaintances there, were you not?" Her question was gentle, but her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, watched for any flicker of unease. Drake's cue paused mid-stroke, the ball clicking softly against another. "Grayson?" "Yes, we crossed paths at Oxford," he said, his voice casual. "He was a bookish sort, always buried in dusty tomes. We weren't close." He resumed his shot, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw, a tell she'd seen in a St. Mary Mead farmer who lied about his harvest to avoid taxes. "Such a tragedy. What happened?" she continued, her tone sympathetic. "You must have been shocked, being so close when he fell. The duel seemed so well rehearsed, yet something went terribly wrong." She let the words hang, her fingers resting lightly on her reticule, as if merely making conversation. Drake straightened, leaning the cue against the table. "Shocked? Of course," he said, his grin returning, though it seemed forced. "It was meant to be a bit of theater, nothing more. I had no idea the sword, well, dagger, was real until Grayson collapsed. Damned bad luck, that's all." His eyes flicked toward the door, as if checking for eavesdroppers, and Miss Marple made a mental note of his choice of words. "Damned bad luck" sounded rehearsed, like a line from one of Mr. Vane's scripts. She shifted tack, her voice softer. "You handled your sword with such skill, Captain. Your military training, I presume? It must give you a keen eye for detail, perhaps even for the properties used in the duel." Her comment was innocent, but she watched his hands, noting the way they clenched briefly before he shoved them into his pockets. "Training teaches you to stay sharp," he said, his tone clipped. "But Vane handled the props. I just took what was given to me." His scar twitched as he spoke, and Miss Marple recalled a St. Mary Mead soldier who hid a gambling debt behind tales of valor. Drake's deflection was smooth, but not seamless. Seeking to unsettle him further, she said, "I heard mention of a lady from your university days, Mrs. Evelyn Carr, perhaps? She seemed quite affected by Mr. Grayson's death." The mention of Mrs. Carr was a calculated probe, based on the footman's earlier gossip about her and Grayson's past. Drake's reaction was subtle, but telling. His shoulders stiffened, and his grin faded for a moment, before returning with forced brightness. "Evelyn? Haven't thought of her in years," he said, picking up the cue again. "She was sweet on Grayson back then, but he broke her heart for his books, water under the bridge." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple caught the edge in his voice, like a village suitor stung by rejection long ago. The triangle of Drake, Grayson, and Mrs. Carr was taking shape, and she suspected it was no mere youthful romance. Excusing herself, Miss Marple left the billiard room and made her way to the Manor's portrait gallery, a long hall lined with stern-faced harrows gazing from gilded frames. She had learned from a maid that Drake, a frequent guest at Ravenwood, often lingered here, drawn to a particular painting of a naval battle. She found it easily, a dramatic scene of ships locked in combat, the artist's signature obscured by time. Standing before it, she considered Drake's military past. The inspector had mentioned in passing that Drake's career ended abruptly, though the reasons were unclear. A scandal, perhaps? She recalled a saint. Mary Mead officer dismissed for smuggling contraband. Such men often carried grudges, especially if someone, like Grayson, knew their secrets. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. A young gardener, his cap in hand, entered to adjust a window shutter. Miss Marple seized the opportunity, her voice warm and disarming. "Such a grand house," she said, gesturing to the portraits. "You must see much of the guests' comings and goings. Did you ever notice Captain Drake with Mr. Grayson, perhaps talking together?" The gardener, flattered by her attention, hesitated, then spoke. "Once or twice, ma'am, in the stables," he said. "Last month I heard them arguing, something about a debt or a promise broken. The captain sounded angry, said something like, 'You'll regret holding that over me.' Mr. Grayson just walked away." The gardener's words were a gold mine, and Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. An argument, a threat. Drake's past with Grayson was more fraught than he admitted. Returning to her room, Miss Marple opened her notebook, jotting down the gardener's account alongside her observations of Drake's demeanor. His military precision, she mused, would make switching a blunted sword for a dagger child's play, especially during the duel's chaos. His clean gloves, noted the night before, suggested a man careful not to leave traces, a habit born of training or guilt. The mention of Mrs. Carr tied him to Grayson in a personal, not just professional conflict, and the gardener's tale of a broken promise hinted at a motive rooted in betrayal. As she closed her notebook, Miss Marple glanced out the window, where the mist was lifting, revealing Ravenwood's gardens in stark clarity. Captain Drake's charm, like the Manor's polished facade, hid a darker truth. She recalled a saint. Mary Mead poacher who smiled while setting traps. Drake, she suspected, was equally adept at concealing his intentions. The next thread to tug, she decided, would be Mr. Vane's role in the duel's staging. But for now, Drake's past loomed large, a shadow cast across the murder's heart. Chapter 7. The Organizer's Ambitions. The late afternoon sun cast a muted glow through Ravenwood Manor's tall windows, painting the oak-paneled study in shades of amber and shadow. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, sat in a corner armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly as a pretext for lingering. She had chosen this room deliberately, having learned from a chatty housemaid that Mr. Clarence Vane, the theatrical organizer of the fatal masquerade, often retreated here to review his notes. Her investigation into Captain Drake's tangled past had sharpened her focus, but now her attention turned to Vane, whose flamboyant exterior and nervous energy suggested ambitions that might have tipped into desperation. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had known men like Vane, showmen whose grand gestures hid precarious lives, and she suspected his role in the duel held secrets yet to be uncovered. The study door creaked open, and Vane entered, his emerald coat replaced by a more subdued gray suit, though his restless movements betrayed the same theatrical flair. His harlequin mask was gone, revealing a face lined with strain, his eyes darting as if expecting an audience or an accuser. He carried a leather portfolio, its edges worn, and set it on the desk with a sigh that was almost performative. Miss Marple looked up, her expression one of mild surprise. "Oh, Mr. Vane," she said, her voice gentle. "I didn't expect to find you here. Such a dreadful business, last night's tragedy. You must be terribly shaken, organizing such a grand event only to have it end so." Vane's shoulders stiffened, but he managed a weak smile. "Shaken? Yes, miss. Marple, is it? A disaster for my reputation, this. I pride myself on flawless productions, and now, murder." His hands gestured expansively, but Miss Marple noted the tremor in his fingers, reminiscent of a St. Mary Mead tailor who overpromised clients to mask his debts. "I assure you," he continued, "the props were perfect. Those swords were blunted, checked by my own hand. That dagger, it wasn't mine." "I'm sure you took every precaution," Miss Marple said soothingly, her needles pausing. "A man of your experience would leave nothing to chance, though I suppose, with so many people about, someone could have tampered with the props unnoticed. You must have been terribly busy overseeing everything." Her tone was sympathetic, but her eyes were keen, watching for any crack in his composure. Vane nodded vigorously, opening his portfolio as if to prove his diligence. "Exactly. I was everywhere. Lights, music, costumes. No time to watch the prop table every second." His voice carried a defensive edge, and Miss Marple made a mental note. His insistence on being busy suggested either truth or a carefully crafted alibi. She recalled a village fete where a conjurer's distraction hid a pickpocket's work. Vane's theatrical chaos could have provided similar cover. Leaning forward slightly, she said, "It must be a heavy burden, managing such events. I heard you've staged spectacles across the county quite successfully, though I imagine funding them can be a challenge." Her words were delicate, but she watched his reaction closely, remembering a saint. Mary Mead, shopkeeper whose grand displays masked looming bankruptcy. Vane's smile faltered, and he busied himself with his papers. "It's a competitive business," he admitted, his tone clipped. "Patrons expect grandeur, and grandeur costs, but I manage." His fingers fumbled with a ledger page, and Miss Marple caught a glimpse of figures. Large sums, some circled in red. She thought of Lady Beatrice's strained finances and wondered if Vane's ambitions had entangled him with Grayson, the manor's financial advisor. "Changing tack," she said. "Mr. Grayson must have admired your work, being such a scholarly man. Did you discuss the duel with him beforehand? He seemed so reserved, yet part of such a dramatic display." Her question was casual, but she noted Vane's sudden stillness, his eyes narrowing as if weighing his response. "Grayson barely spoke to him," Vane said too quickly. "He was Lady Beatrice's man, all numbers and ledgers. He agreed to the duel for the spectacle, nothing more." His voice was dismissive, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in his expression, like a village actor caught forgetting his lines. She pressed gently, her tone disarming. "Yet he was so central to the event. I heard he was in the library often, perhaps reviewing your plans?" Vane's hand tightened on the portfolio. "He poked his nose into everything," he muttered, then caught himself. "I mean, he was curious, that's all. Asked about costs, props, the usual. Nothing out of the ordinary." His words were rushed, and Miss Marple noted the contradiction. Grayson's curiosity was no small matter, if it unsettled Vane so. Excusing herself, Miss Marple left the study and made her way to the servants' quarters, where gossip flowed as freely as tea. She found a kitchen maid polishing silver, her hands busy, but her eyes eager for conversation. "Such a grand affair, before it all went wrong," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. "Mr. Vane must have worked so hard. Did you see him with Mr. Grayson at all, perhaps discussing the ball?" The maid, flattered by the attention, leaned closer. "Oh, yes, ma'am. A week ago, I saw them in the courtyard, talking heated-like. Mr. Vane was waving his arms, saying something about money owed. Mr. Grayson looked cross, said, 'You'll get nothing more until I see the books.' Then they saw me and stopped." The maid's words were a revelation, and Miss Marple thanked her, her mind piecing together the puzzle. Vane's financial dependence on Grayson, like Lady Beatrice's, suggested a motive. If Grayson had threatened to cut him off, or worse, expose some irregularity. Returning to the main hall, Miss Marple paused by a display case near the staircase, where antique weapons gleamed under glass. Among them was a space where a dagger, similar in style to the murder weapon, might have rested. She recalled the serpent motif on the fatal blade, and wondered if Vane, with his access to Ravenwood's treasures as the event's organizer, had sourced it from here. A footman approached, and she seized the opportunity. "Such fine pieces," she said, gesturing to the case. "Was there a dagger here before the ball, do you know?" The footman nodded. "Aye, ma'am, a fancy one with a snake on the hilt. Noticed it missing a day or two before the ball. Thought it was taken for cleaning." His words confirmed her suspicion. The dagger was no prop but a manor artifact, accessible to someone like Vane, who knew Ravenwood's layout intimately. As she returned to her room, Miss Marple opened her notebook, jotting down the maid's account, Vane's ledger, and the missing dagger. His theatrical bluster, she mused, was a mask for financial strain, much like a St. Mary mead merchant who staged lavish sales to hide insolvency. Vane's access to the props and the manor's collection gave him opportunity, and his argument with Grayson hinted at a motive, perhaps a debt Grayson refused to forgive, or a secret he threatened to expose. The organizers' ambitions, Miss Marple realized, were a thread as tangled as any, and she would need to unravel it carefully to find where it led. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting Ravenwood in twilight. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Mrs. Evelyn Carr, whose quiet despair lingered in her mind. Vane's role was clearer now, but the web of motives, financial, personal, vengeful, was growing tighter, and she was determined to trace its strands to the heart of the murder. Chapter 8. The Guest's Disguise. The evening shadows deepened over Ravenwood Manor, the mist curling around its turrets like a conspirator's cloak. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her guest room's fireplace, her knitting untouched, reflected on the threads she had gathered. Lady Beatrice's financial strain, Captain Drake's shadowed past, and Mr. Vane's desperate ambitions. Each suspect wove a pattern of motive and opportunity, but the enigmatic Mrs. Evelyn Carr, with her haunted eyes and nervous fan, remained an elusive figure. Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of untangling St. Mary Mead's quiet scandals, told her that Mrs. Carr's presence at the masquerade was no coincidence. Tonight, she resolved to probe the guest's disguise, sensing a personal wound that might connect to Theodore Grayson's murder. Dinner was a strained affair, the grand dining room's candle-lit opulence at odds with the guests' subdued murmurs. Inspector Harrow, stationed near the door, watched the assembly like a hawk, his familial tie to Lady Beatrice evident in his occasional glances of concern toward her. Miss Marple, seated near the end of the table, observed Mrs. Carr, who had exchanged her silver gown for a black dress, its severity accentuating her pale face. Her hands, bare of gloves, toyed with a napkin, twisting it with a restlessness that reminded Miss Marple of a St. Mary Mead widow who clutched her rosary while hiding a betrayal. Seizing a moment after the meal, as guests lingered over coffee, Miss Marple approached Mrs. Carr, who stood alone by a window overlooking the darkened gardens. "Mrs. Carr," she said, her voice soft as a summer breeze, "I couldn't help but notice your distress last night. Such a shocking event. Mr. Grayson's death. Were you close to him?" Her tone was one of gentle concern, but her eyes were sharp, noting the way Mrs. Carr's fingers tightened on the napkin. Mrs. Carr's gaze flickered, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing. "I knew Theodore. Long ago," she said finally, her voice low. "We were friends at university, nothing more." Her words were clipped, and Miss Marple recognized the careful phrasing of someone guarding a deeper truth, like a village girl denying a lost love to avoid gossip. "How sad to lose an old friend so suddenly," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic. "I saw you watching the duel so intently. It must have been dreadful seeing him fall." She paused, letting the silence invite confession, a tactic she had used with a saint. Mary Mead seamstress, who revealed a theft under similar gentle pressure. Mrs. Carr's eyes darted to the window, as if seeking escape in the night. "It was horrible," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I hadn't seen him in years, but I came to the ball because I wanted closure." Her words faltered, and Miss Marple noted the flush creeping up her neck, a sign of emotion, barely contained. "Closure is a heavy thing," Miss Marple said softly. "In my village, we had a young woman who sought the same after a broken engagement. It takes courage to face such memories." Her words were a delicate probe, and Mrs. Carr's reaction was immediate. Her napkin fell to the floor, and she bent to retrieve it, her hands shaking. There was no engagement, Mrs. Carr said quickly, straightening. Theodore chose his studies over everything else. I moved on. Her voice was firm, but her eyes, red-rimmed and glistening, told a different story. Miss Marple recalled the footman's gossip about an argument in the rose garden, and now the gardener's tale of Drake's threat to Grayson over a promise broken. Mrs. Carr's past with Grayson, and perhaps Drake, was a knot she needed to untangle. Excusing herself, Miss Marple made her way to the servants' hall, where the staff, less guarded than their masters, often let slip valuable truths. She found a parlor maid dusting a sideboard, her youthful face eager for distraction. "Such a grand house," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. "You must see so much working here. Did you notice Mrs. Carr before the ball, perhaps speaking with Mr. Grayson or Captain Drake?" Her question was casual, but her eyes were alert for any flicker of insight. The maid, flattered by the attention, nodded. "I saw Mrs. Carr in the hall, ma'am, the day before the ball. She was with Mr. Grayson near the staircase. They were whispering, and she looked upset, said something about, 'You owe me an explanation.' He shushed her, looked right nervous. The maid's words were a gold mine, and Miss Marple thanked her, her mind racing. An explanation demanded suggested a personal grievance, one Mrs. Carr had carried to Ravenwood. Seeking further clues, Miss Marple wandered to the terrace, where Mrs. Carr had stood during the duel. The stone balustrade was cool under her fingers, and she noticed a small object glinting in the moonlight, a pearl earring half hidden in a crevice. It matched the adornments on Mrs. Carr's discarded mask, which Miss Marple had seen in the drawing room, dusted with lavender-scented powder. She pocketed the earring carefully, recalling a saint. Mary Mead theft, where a lost brooch led to a confession. Mrs. Carr's presence near the terrace, so close to the duel's stage, placed her near the crime, if not in it. Returning to the manor, Miss Marple sought out the housekeeper, a stern woman with a key ring that jangled like a jailer's. "Such a tragedy," Miss Marple said, her tone mournful. "I noticed Mrs. Carr seemed so affected. Did she visit Ravenwood often, or was this a special occasion?" The housekeeper, softened by Miss Marple's grandmotherly air, pursed her lips. "First time I've seen her, ma'am. She arrived 2 days ago, asked to see the library before the ball, said she was researching something for Mr. Grayson. Looked more like she was searching for him, if you ask me." The housekeeper's words added another layer. Mrs. Carr's visit was purposeful, her research a possible pretext. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the library, where Grayson's ledgers hinted at financial secrets. Had Mrs. Carr been seeking evidence of Grayson's dealings, or something more personal? She recalled a saint, Mary Mead spinster, who rifled through a suitor's letters, seeking proof of infidelity. Mrs. Carr's actions suggested a similar drive, fueled by unresolved pain. In her room, Miss Marple opened her notebook, jotting down the maid's account, the earring, and the housekeeper's revelation. Mrs. Carr's disguise, she mused, was not just her mask, but her pretense of detachment. Her history with Grayson, likely a jilted love, given her emotional intensity, gave her motive, and her proximity to the duel offered opportunity. The earring near the terrace suggested she lingered close to the stage, perhaps witnessing, or enabling, the dagger's switch. Yet her grief seemed genuine, unlike the calculated facades of Lady Beatrice, Drake, or Vane. As the manor settled into uneasy silence, Miss Marple gazed at the fire, its flames casting shadows that danced like the suspect's secrets. Mrs. Carr's past, intertwined with Grayson's and possibly Drake's, was a thread that pulsed with personal betrayal. The next step, she decided, was to reconstruct the duel's fatal moment. But for now, Mrs. Carr's hidden wound loomed large, a clue to the heart of Ravenwood's tragedy. Chapter 9. Threads of Motive. The second morning at Ravenwood Manor broke with a chill that seeped through the heavy drapes, mirroring the unease that had settled over the household. Miss Jane Marple, seated at a small writing desk in her guest room, reviewed her notebook, its pages filled with the careful observations of the past 2 days. The suspects, Lady Beatrice Harrow, Captain Lionel Drake, Mr. Clarence Vane, and Mrs. Evelyn Carr, formed a web of motives and opportunities, each thread knotted with secrets, financial ruin, old grudges, desperate ambitions, and a broken heart. The murder of Theodore Grayson, stabbed with an antique dagger during a mock duel, was no random act, and Miss Marple's mind, sharpened by years of unraveling St. Mary Mead's quiet dramas, was piecing together the pattern. Today, she would weave these threads closer, seeking the moment when intent became action. Breakfast was a hushed affair, the dining room's grandeur dimmed by the weight of suspicion. Inspector Harrow, his mustache bristling with purpose, announced that his men had found no fingerprints on the dagger, its hilt wiped clean, a detail that confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion of premeditation. She watched the suspects as they ate. Lady Beatrice, her navy gown pristine, but her eyes shadowed. Drake, his charm subdued, his scar twitching as he glanced at the inspector. Vane, fidgeting with his coffee cup, his face pale, and Mrs. Carr, her black dress a silent mourning, her gaze fixed on her untouched plate. Each, Miss Marple noted, was a study in concealed tension, like villagers at a parish meeting after a theft. After breakfast, Miss Marple slipped into the ballroom, where the stage remained cordoned off, a constable posted at its edge. The bloodstain on the marble had been cleaned, but the prop table stood untouched, its blunted swords and empty dagger sheath a stark reminder of the crime. She approached the constable, her demeanor unthreatening. "Such a terrible thing," she said softly. "To think a weapon was switched so cleverly. You must have seen many such cases. Was the table left unattended at all before the duel?" Her voice was gentle, but her eyes were alert, as if merely curious. The constable, a young man with an earnest face, hesitated, then said, "I wasn't here then, ma'am, but the stagehand, Tom, said it was chaos. Servants running about, Mr. Vane shouting orders. Captain Drake was by the table alone for a moment, checking the swords," he said. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing the detail alongside the footman's earlier account. Drake's access was confirmed, but Vane's oversight of the props and Lady Beatrice's knowledge of the manor's artifacts kept them in the frame. Mrs. Carr's proximity to the terrace, marked by her earring, added another layer. Seeking to clarify the timeline, Miss Marple wandered to the servants' hall, where she found Tom, the stagehand, polishing boots. His hands were calloused, his manner open, and Miss Marple's grandmotherly air put him at ease. "You must have worked so hard for the ball," she said, her tone warm. "All those props to manage. Did you notice anything odd before the duel? Perhaps someone near the table who shouldn't have been?" Tom scratched his head, then said, "Well, ma'am, it was a right mess. Mr. Vane was fussing over the lights and Captain Drake was there, like I told the constable. But I saw Mrs. Carr, too, lingering by the terrace doors, looking at the table like she was waiting for something." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Mrs. Carr's presence, so close to the props, was a new thread, tying her to the moment of opportunity. She thanked Tom and made her way to the library, where Grayson's ledgers still lay on the desk. She examined them again, noting the loan to Lady Beatrice, circled in red, and a separate entry referencing Vane, a sum marked event expenses, with a note in Grayson's hand. Verify repayment. The financial ties were tightening, but Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Mrs. Carr's personal motive. The maid's account of her demand for an explanation from Grayson suggested a wound that might have festered into vengeance. In the afternoon, Miss Marple sought out the manor's curator, a wiry man with spectacles who managed Ravenwood's collection of antiques. She found him in a small office cataloging artifacts. "Such a remarkable collection," she said, gesturing to a display case. "That dagger used in the duel, it looked like something from Ravenwood's own treasures. Was it part of your inventory?" The curator frowned, adjusting his glasses. "It was, ma'am. A 17th century piece, serpent hilt, jade inlay, reported missing 2 days before the ball. I assumed it was sent for repair, but—" His voice trailed off, and Miss Marple nodded, her suspicion confirmed. The dagger's theft was deliberate, by someone with access to the manor's inner sanctum. As she left the curator, Miss Marple pieced together the motives. Lady Beatrice, desperate to save Ravenwood, might have silenced Grayson to hide financial misdeeds. Drake, threatened by Grayson's knowledge of a past scandal, had the skill to execute a precise strike. Vane, reliant on Grayson's funds, faced ruin if exposed. Mrs. Carr, nursing a broken heart, might have sought revenge for a betrayal long ago. Each had opportunity. Drake and Vane near the prop table, Lady Beatrice with her manor's keys, Mrs. Carr by the terrace. The dagger's clean hilt suggested a careful hand, but whose? In her room, Miss Marple opened her notebook, sketching a diagram of the suspects and their connections to Grayson: money, grudges, ambition, love. She recalled a saint. Mary Mead mystery where a stolen will revealed a web of greed. Here, the dagger was the key, its theft a calculated act. The stagehand's words placed Drake and Mrs. Carr near the props, but Vane's oversight and Lady Beatrice's access could not be dismissed. The truth, she sensed, lay in the moment. The dagger replaced the sword, a sleight of hand hidden by the masquerade's chaos. As twilight fell, Miss Marple gazed out her window, the manor's silhouette stark against the fading light. The threads of motive were converging, but the final knot, the act of murder, remained elusive. She would need to retrace the duel's fatal moment, but for now, the suspects' secrets were aligning, each a clue to the heart of Ravenwood's tragedy. Chapter 10. The Fatal Moment. The third morning at Ravenwood Manor brought a restless energy, the air heavy with the weight of an unsolved crime. Miss Jane Marple, her gray shawl draped over her shoulders, stood in the ballroom, where the velvet ropes still marked the scene of Theodore Grayson's murder. The marble floor gleamed, the bloodstain scrubbed away. But the prop table, with its blunted swords and empty dagger sheath, remained a silent witness. Her notebook, now thick with observations, lay tucked in her reticule, its pages mapping the motives of Lady Beatrice Harrow, Captain Lionel Drake, Mr. Clarence Vane, and Mrs. Evelyn Carr. Each suspect's secrets, financial desperation, old grudges, thwarted ambitions, and a jilted heart, formed a web around the fatal duel, but the moment of the dagger's switch eluded her. Today, Miss Marple resolved to reconstruct that moment certain it held the key to unmasking the killer. The ballroom was quiet, save for the soft tread of a constable patrolling the perimeter. Inspector Harrow had allowed Miss Marple access, his initial skepticism softened by her unassuming air and the occasional insight she'd shared, disguised as idle chatter. She approached the prop table, her eyes tracing the layout. Two blunted swords, their tips dulled for safety, and the empty sheath where the serpent-hilted dagger had been found. She recalled the stagehand's account of Captain Drake inspecting the props moments before the duel, and Mrs. Carr's lingering presence near the terrace doors. Mr. Vane's oversight of the props and Lady Beatrice's access to the manor's antiques kept them in the frame. But the act itself, a sleight of hand under the masquerade's chaos, required precision and nerve. Miss Marple closed her eyes, picturing the duel as it unfolded, the clash of blades, the crowd's gasps, Drake's flamboyant lunges, Grayson's measured parries. She imagined the moment Grayson faltered, clutching his side, the blood seeping through his burgundy robe. The dagger, she knew, had been substituted for one of the blunted swords. But when? She opened her eyes, her gaze settling on the table's edge, where a faint scratch marked the wood, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. A clue, perhaps, of hurried tampering. She recalled a saint. Mary Mead fate, where a tampered prop had caused a near accident. Here, the switch was no mistake, but a calculated act of murder. Seeking confirmation, Miss Marple sought out Tom, the stagehand, whom she found in the servants' hall, mending a torn curtain. His boyish face lit up at her approach, her grandmotherly demeanor disarming his caution. "Tom, my dear," she said, her voice warm. "You were so helpful about the prop table. Can you recall exactly what Captain Drake did when he checked the swords? Every detail matters in such a dreadful case." Tom nodded, eager to assist. "He was by the table, ma'am, just before the duel started. Said he wanted to test the balance, twirled one sword in his hand, then put it back. Mr. Vane was off fussing with the lights and no one else was near, 'cept maybe that lady in silver by the terrace." Miss Marple's heart quickened. Drake's moment alone with the props was critical, and his military training, sleight of hand learned in covert operations perhaps, made him capable of a swift substitution. She thanked Tom and made her way to the terrace, where Mrs. Carr had stood during the duel. The stone balustrade bore no new clues, but the pearl earring she'd found the previous day, now tucked in her reticule, tied Mrs. Carr to this spot. Had she watched the switch, or even distracted the crowd to enable it? Miss Marple's mind flickered to a St. Mary Mead card game, where a player's glance diverted attention from a cheated hand. The masquerade's chaos offered similar cover. Returning to the ballroom, Miss Marple paced the stage, reconstructing the duel's choreography. Drake, she recalled, had executed a flamboyant feint just before Grayson's stumble, drawing the crowd's eyes. It was a moment of distraction, perfect for slipping a dagger into play. Yet Vane's absence, fussing with lights, left him unaccounted for, and Lady Beatrice, as hostess, could have moved freely through the crowd. Mrs. Carr's intense gaze, fixed on Grayson, suggested she anticipated something. Perhaps not murder, but a confrontation. Miss Marple paused, her fingers brushing the scratch on the prop table. The dagger's weight, heavier than the sword's, could have caused it, suggesting a last-minute switch under pressure. To test her theory, Miss Marple sought the manor's armorer, a grizzled man who maintained Ravenwood's antique weapons. She found him in a basement workshop, sharpening a blade. "Such craftsmanship in that dagger," she said, her tone admiring. "The one used in the duel. Its weight must differ from the blunted swords. Would it be difficult to swap one unnoticed?" The armorer, flattered by her interest, rubbed his chin. "Aye, ma'am. It's heavier, with a thicker hilt. Swapping it quick-like would take a steady hand, someone used to weapons. You'd need a moment when eyes were elsewhere, say, during a loud clash or a crowd's cheer." His words confirmed her suspicion. The switch required skill and timing, qualities Drake possessed in abundance. Yet Vane's theatrical expertise could have orchestrated a distraction, and Lady Beatrice's knowledge of the manor's layout gave her access to the dagger. Mrs. Carr's role remained unclear, accomplice or witness. Miss Marple thanked the armorer and returned to her room, where she opened her notebook, sketching the duel's timeline. Drake's inspection, Vane's absence, Mrs. Carr's proximity, Lady Beatrice's oversight. The scratch on the table, the dagger's weight, and the crowd's distraction formed a sequence, pointing to a deliberate act in the duel's crescendo. As she wrote, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to motive. Drake's threat to Grayson, overheard by the gardener, suggested a past scandal, perhaps one Grayson could expose. Vane's financial dependence on Grayson, noted in the ledger, hinted at desperation. Lady Beatrice's hidden debts, uncovered in the library, gave her reason to silence him. Mrs. Carr's demand for an explanation spoke of personal betrayal. The fatal moment, Miss Marple realized, was not just the stab, but the decision to act, born of one suspect's breaking point. Outside, the manor's gardens lay shrouded in dusk, the mist curling like a question mark. Miss Marple closed her notebook, her mind fixed on the duel's chaos, where a killer had seized their chance. The next step was to confront the suspects, to test their reactions and unravel the final thread. She recalled a saint. Mary, mead theft, where a single question exposed a liar. Here, the truth lay in the moment. The dagger struck, and she was close to naming its wielder. Chapter 11. The Confrontation. The evening of the third day at Ravenwood Manor draped the estate in a heavy silence, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl and the creak of ancient timbers. Miss Jane Marple, her gray shawl wrapped tightly against the chill, sat in her guest room, her notebook open before her. The threads of the investigation, Lady Beatrice's financial secrets, Captain Drake's shadowed past, Mr. Vane's desperate ambitions, and Mrs. Carr's personal wounds, had woven a tight web around Theodore Grayson's murder. The fatal moment, when a serpent-hilted dagger replaced a blunted sword, pointed to a calculated act, and Miss Marple's instincts, honed by countless St. Mary Mead intrigues, told her the truth was near. Tonight, she would gather the suspects in the library, where Grayson's ledgers had hinted at hidden truths, to unravel the final knot. Inspector Harrow, persuaded by Miss Marple's quiet insistence, agreed to the gathering, though his skeptical glance suggested he viewed her as a meddling spinster. The library, with its towering bookshelves and flickering gas lamps, was a fitting stage, its air thick with the scent of leather and secrets. Lady Beatrice, Captain Drake, Mr. Vane, and Mrs. Carr were summoned, each entering with a mix of wariness and defiance. Miss Marple stood near the mahogany desk, her small figure dwarfed by the room's grandeur, but commanding attention with her serene authority, like a village matron calming a parish dispute. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice gentle but clear, her eyes scanning the faces before her. Lady Beatrice, in a high-necked black gown, sat rigidly, her hands clasped tightly. Drake, his tweed jacket immaculate, leaned against a bookcase, his scar stark in the lamplight. Vane, his gray suit rumpled, fidgeted in a chair, his eyes darting. Mrs. Carr, her mourning dress accentuating her pallor, stood near a window, her gaze distant but alert. Inspector Harrow, arms crossed, stood by the door, his presence a silent endorsement of Miss Marple's inquiry. "The death of Mr. Grayson was no accident," Miss Marple said, her tone measured. "A dagger, stolen from Ravenwood's collection, was slipped into the duel, a deliberate act disguised as theater. Each of you had reason to wish him gone, and each had a moment to act." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle, as she had done at a saint. Mary Mead tea party, where a single remark exposed a liar. She turned to Lady Beatrice first. "Your ladyship, Ravenwood's debts are no secret, at least to those who look closely. Mr. Grayson, your financial advisor, knew of irregularities in your accounts, loans unrepaid, funds perhaps misdirected. His ledgers, found here, suggest he pressed you to explain. Did you fear his scrutiny?" Lady Beatrice's lips parted, her face paling. "I had nothing to hide," she said sharply. "Theodore was helping me, not threatening me." Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple noted the defensive edge, like a village widow caught inflating her charity. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Mr. Vane. "Your ambitions, Mr. Vane, are grand, but costly. Grayson's ledger shows you owed him money for past events, funds he questioned. An argument in the courtyard, overheard by a maid, suggests he refused further support. Your access to the props gave you opportunity. Did you seize it to protect your career?" Vane's face flushed, his hands flailing. "I'm no killer," he protested. "I was with the lights, not the props, when it happened." His panic, Miss Marple thought, was genuine, but panic could mask guilt as easily as fear. To Mrs. Carr, she said softly, "Your history with Mr. Grayson runs deep, a love lost to his ambition, a wound unhealed. You demanded an explanation, as a maid overheard, and your earring near the terrace places you close to the duel. Did you act to settle that old score?" Mrs. Carr's eyes widened, her hands twisting her handkerchief. "I only wanted answers," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't. I couldn't." Her grief seemed raw, but Miss Marple knew emotion could cloak intent, as it had with a St. Mary Mead girl who wept while hiding a theft. Finally, she faced Captain Drake, whose grin was absent, his eyes cold. "Captain, your military skill made you adept at precision, and your moment alone with the props, as the stagehand saw, gave you opportunity. Grayson knew of a scandal from your past. Smuggling, perhaps, as a gardener overheard you threaten him. The duel was your stage to silence him, wasn't it?" Drake's scar twitched, his posture stiffening. "You're grasping, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "I fought as scripted. The dagger wasn't mine." His denial was firm, but his eyes flicked to the door, a tell Miss Marple recognized from a village poacher caught in a lie. She stepped to the desk, where a replica of the dagger, borrowed from the curator for effect, lay gleaming. "This dagger," she said, "was stolen from Ravenwood's collection, its hilt wiped clean." The switch required a moment of distraction, provided by the duel's climax. A feint by Captain Drake, drawing all eyes. The table's scratch, the dagger's weight, confirm it was swapped just before. Only someone with skill and access could have done it. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. Captain Drake, your gloves were clean, despite the duel's intensity, a sign of care, of premeditation. You inspected the props, as Tom confirmed, and your training made the switch effortless. Drake's face hardened, his hands clenching. "You've no proof," he said, his voice tight. "Anyone could have touched that table." Lady Beatrice shifted uncomfortably, veins fidgeting stilled, and Mrs. Carr's eyes filled with tears. Miss Marple pressed on, her voice unwavering. "Grayson's threat to expose your smuggling scandal, overheard in the stables, gave you motive. The duel was your chance, disguised as theater. You struck with precision, knowing the crowd would see only a performance." The room was silent, the air taut. Inspector Harrow stepped forward, his skepticism replaced by interest. Drake's grin returned, but it was strained, his scar a stark line. "You're clever, old lady," he said, "but you're weaving tales, not facts." Yet his voice cracked, and Miss Marple saw the fear in his eyes, like a St. Mary Mead thief cornered by truth. She turned to the inspector. "The evidence is there. Drake's access, his motive, the dagger's theft. Search his rooms. You may find traces of the manor's polish, used to clean the hilt." Harrow nodded, signaling a constable. Drake's composure faltered, his hands rising as if to protest, then falling. The library seemed to hold its breath, the suspects' masks, literal and figurative, slipping under the weight of Miss Marple's words. As the constable led Drake away, Miss Marple felt no triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solved. The confrontation had laid bare the truth, but one final act remained, to hear the killer's confession and to tie the last thread of Ravenwood's tragedy. Chapter 12. Justice Behind the Mask. The library of Ravenwood Manor, its air still heavy with the echoes of confrontation, seemed to exhale as Captain Lionel Drake was led away by Inspector Harrow's constable. Miss Jane Marple stood quietly by the mahogany desk, her small figure a calm anchor amidst the storm of revelation. The gas lamps flickered, casting shadows that danced across the faces of Lady Beatrice Harrow, Mr. Clarence Vane, and Mrs. Evelyn Carr, each marked by a mix of relief and lingering unease. The truth had been laid bare. Drake, driven by a buried scandal, had turned a mock duel into a murder, using a stolen dagger to silence Theodore Grayson. Yet Miss Marple knew the final act required a confession, a peeling away of the last mask to confirm the justice she had uncovered. Inspector Harrow returned, his face stern, but his eyes betraying a grudging respect for Miss Marple's insight. "We found Polish in Drake's room, just as you suggested," he said, his voice low. "The same kind used on Ravenwood's antiques, traces on a cloth hidden in his trunk. He's ready to talk." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind alert. She had seen such moments in St. Mary Mead, where a cornered culprit, like a poacher caught with stolen game, would unravel under the weight of evidence. The suspects were reconvened in the drawing room, its velvet curtains drawn against the night, creating a cocoon of tension. Drake sat in a high-backed chair, his tweed jacket rumpled, his scar stark against his ashen face. Gone was the charming grin. His eyes, cold and defiant, met Miss Marple's with a flicker of resignation. Lady Beatrice stood by the fireplace, her composure restored, but her hands clasped tightly. Vane, his nervous energy subdued, sat slumped, as if his theatrical world had collapsed. Mrs. Carr, her morning dress a silent testament to her grief, gazed at Drake with a mix of sorrow and accusation. Miss Marple spoke first, her voice gentle but firm. as if addressing a village gathering. "Captain Drake, the evidence is clear. The dagger, stolen from Ravenwood's collection, was switched during your inspection of the props, as the stagehand witnessed. Your military skill ensured a precise strike, masked by the duel's chaos. Grayson's knowledge of your smuggling scandal, overheard in the stables, gave you motive. The polish on your cloth seals it. Will you tell us why?" Her words were a quiet challenge, like those she used to coax a confession from a saint. Mary Mead, shopkeeper, caught pilfering. Drake's shoulders sagged, his defiance crumbling. "You're too sharp, Miss Marple," he said, his voice hoarse. "Grayson had me cornered. Years ago, at university, I ran a smuggling ring. Small, but profitable. Grayson found out, kept it quiet for Evelyn's sake, but he never forgot. When we met again here, he threatened to expose me unless I paid him off. My career, my reputation, it would have been ruined." His scar twitched, and Miss Marple noted the bitterness in his tone, like a village soldier resentful of a rival's leverage. He continued, his words spilling like a dam breaking. "The duel was my chance. I knew Ravenwood's collection, saw the dagger in its case weeks ago. I took it, kept it hidden, and during the prop check I swapped it for the sword. The crowd was caught up in my feint. No one saw. I thought it would look like an accident, a prop mix-up." He glanced at Vane, who flinched. "I didn't count on you, Miss Marple, seeing through the act." His voice held a grudging admiration, but his eyes were hollow. Lady Beatrice gasped softly, her hand rising to her throat. "Theodore never mentioned a scandal," she said, her voice trembling. "He was trying to help me with Ravenwood's debts." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts confirmed. Grayson's integrity had made him a threat to multiple secrets. Vane, his face pale, muttered, "I swear, I didn't know. The props were my responsibility, but I was with the lights." His panic was genuine, and Miss Marple believed him, a man too frantic to orchestrate murder. Mrs. Carr, tears streaming silently, spoke at last. "Theodore deserved better," she whispered. "I wanted answers, not this." Her grief, Miss Marple saw, was untainted by guilt, a wound reopened but not vengeful. Inspector Harrow stepped forward, his handcuffs glinting. "Lionel Drake, you're under arrest for the murder of Theodore Grayson," he said, his voice formal but firm. As the constable led Drake away, the room seemed to exhale, the tension breaking like a storm passing. Lady Beatrice sank into a chair, her face a mask of resolve. "I'll sort out Ravenwood's finances properly," she said, almost to herself. "No more secrets." Miss Marple nodded, recognizing the determination of a woman ready to face her truth, like a St. Mary Mead widow rebuilding after scandal. Vane rose, muttering about salvaging his career, his ambitions chastened but not extinguished. Mrs. Carr slipped out, her steps heavy with sorrow, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy for the woman whose past had been stirred but not avenged. As the drawing room emptied, Miss Marple gathered her shawl, her work done. The masks of Ravenwood, deceit, charm, ambition, and grief had fallen, revealing the human frailties beneath. The next morning, as she packed her modest suitcase, Miss Marple glanced at the misty gardens, now bathed in dawn's light. The train to St. Mary Mead awaited, and with it, the quiet of her village life. She closed her notebook, its pages a record of a tragedy solved through patient observation. "Masks hide faces," she mused, "but motives always betray the truth." With a final look at Ravenwood's towers, she stepped into the carriage, ready to return to her roses and the simpler puzzles of home.